Mohammed, Simon helpfully tells me there's a mute sign somewhere on the other screen. In light of not being able to have Lynn, we're going to start directly. I want to have a general discussion, very brief one, some general issues relating to the Gulf, collectively, all countries, hopefully, and then have 4 or 5 different sessions, little discussions, sub-discussions, about the role of international human rights mechanisms versus bilateral interventions in the first instance, the role of human rights defenders, and the question of arbitrary arrest of human rights defenders. The one after that will be in relation to academic freedom, and we heard earlier in the session that there are, I think James talked about the sort of internationalization of academia, the Western universities being in the Gulf and so on. So academic freedom, something that I think Matthew would have something to say about. And I want to end with any signs of opportunity, bright spots, things that are good about the Gulf. With that, I want to get started just with a general, some general issues, if you would, all 3 of you, in relation to accountability. Now, the Jamal Khashoggi case sadly showed us that there's a high degree of unaccountability from Gulf states, at least Saudi Arabia. And my question to you all is, if that's the case, how can those governments be held to account? We'll start with Taif. What are the options? Just very briefly, what do you think are some of the options on accountability?
So I could talk about it from like an international perspective. Okay, so I can talk about it from an international perspective. So if we're thinking in terms of the UN, for example, there are treaty bodies, so there are independent groups of experts which review countries every few years. And often this is a really good way of holding countries to account on their human rights records, because these bodies, they basically publish a list of recommendations that civil society can then use to sort of follow up and push for reforms. There are a few other mechanisms which I think are slightly less effective. So there's the Universal Periodic Review, and Saudi's Universal Periodic Review was a few months ago. We saw that a lot of questions came up in relation to Jamal Khashoggi, and there's also the Special Rapporteur. So we know that Agnes Callamard wrote the most sort of the longest independent report on what happened to Khashoggi, and that this has really been used as a springboard to keep attention on Saudi Arabia in relation to this case. However, having said this, it's also, I think, important to note that often these mechanisms, they can't really hold states to account to the extent that there aren't any repercussions within international law. If a state doesn't want to do something, usually it just doesn't do it. Yeah.
So, turning this internally, largely speaking across the Gulf, if there were to be any serious and meaningful accountability, it would undermine the institution of the monarchy that there is in the Gulf. Now, looking at an example, let's say Kuwait, at the moment, what's happening there domestically, there are some examples of a degree of accountability, but largely speaking across the Gulf, it's due to that combination, the mixing of the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive branches of government, it's highly unlikely that there will be any meaningful discipline or accountability at that end.
Oh, rather negative. Okay, Tara?
As Taif had said about the United Nations and the Universal Periodic Review, Bahrain just in the last week came out with their interim report on Bahrain, which really is a media drive and for glossing over and cosmetic purposes, but the reality is that the situation has got much worse in the last few years. there may be laws that are laws within the country, but the actual implementation of those laws isn't happening. And the legislative system itself, there's no independence in the judiciary. I think that one of the things that when you're talking about how to impact it, really making from an international perspective, making a commitment to updating various government delegations from other countries on the crises as they happen, making sure that the pertinent information is there with the foreign ministers from other countries, and maintaining ties with them so that we have developed a relationship where they know that the information that we're giving them is trustworthy and good. And then really the difficulty about bringing them to justice, specifically in Bahrain, is that some of the perpetrators themselves are members of the royal family, so it really isn't a will for justice. And in this period of what we aspirationally call transitional justice, there just isn't the capacity, because even United Nations special rapporteurs have still been not permitted to enter the country to either monitor the ongoing protests or to make any documents or have any to do any investigations inside the country. So we're in a terribly long limbo phase.
Thanks, Liz. You've both touched on things that I want to come to next, which is the trade-off between international mechanisms and bilateral initiatives. And Taif mentioned that the report by Agnes Callamard is the most in-depth, independent report about the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. But also I think you mentioned the treaty bodies, or if you didn't, I'm going to mention it now, that they too are independent in a context in which there is no or very little independent reporting, such as there is. It's actually based outside the country, like Al-Quds, like Salam, and so on. But on the other hand, there might be an argument that years ago, or maybe even more recently, that pressure from the UK, pressure from the US, when, for example, Ahmed Mansour was initially detained some years back, part of the UAE 5 case, that pressure, bilateral pressure, US and British pressure, facilitated or at least enabled him to be released a little bit earlier, him and indeed others, in November of 2005 or something. And that arguably the BICI process in Bahrain following unrest there could have been facilitated by bilateral, multilateral intervention. My question is this: which of those, and Tara, you raised, making foreign ministers aware of what's actually happening on the ground. What's the trade-off? How do you work that? How do you choose, if it's the bilateral approach, do you choose an Irish government, a Canadian government, and really work on them to leverage others? Or is our better route in the long run, at least in the kind of transition that we're seeing through the international mechanisms that Taif's been talking about?
So I think bilateralism really works when you have a foreign national, for example, who's detained in another Gulf country. So for example, first of all, I think it works if the person who's detained is like from a Western country, because I think countries like the UAE, for example, actually care about their image abroad, and therefore they have a country like the UK has a lot more leverage. However, in other cases that I've worked on, for example, I worked on the case of a journalist called something Taysir, what's his name? Anyway.
A Jordanian.
Yes, he's a Jordanian journalist who was detained in the UAE because he tweeted something. Pardon? Taysir al-Najjar, there we go. We got the Jordanian embassy there really involved, and they were pushing the UAE authorities, but they didn't care. He served his sentence, and because he couldn't pay a fine that they wanted him to pay, he also served extra time in prison. So I think it's really dependent on who the person who's arbitrarily detained or whatever is, and the country that they're from, or the country that they are a national of, and the kind of international relations these countries have
we found that bringing attention, raising cases with the media, if at all possible, was beneficial because, again, the Bahrainis really don't like to be, they just don't like any negative attention brought to them, and they try to buy their way out of, like, look at the Formula One and the investments that they make in various science exhibitions around the world. But I suppose that really was a very big challenge to overcome, that everywhere that we would go to speak to ministers, or whether it was the ILO, so we would talk to trade unionists or whatever, or like the National Women's Council, the regime would send shadow stooges to follow up on all of our meetings to put the story right.
Is that when in Bahrain or in the country itself, or in Ireland?
No, I'm talking about in Ireland, in Brussels, in wherever, in Istanbul, everywhere that we were having a conference or where we were speaking at events, they would always send a team behind us. And one year in particular, when we were at the United Nations, it would have been the year of the Universal Periodic Review in 2013.
For Bahrain?
Yeah, for Bahrain. They had sent over 300 delegates from the government to join, and there were only about 12 or 14 of us. And then they continued by, there were punitive measures taken against anybody who participated in the United Nations in communicating with them. So they would be arrested when they went home, or their family members that would be taken. And then they started to ban people from leaving the country. So we have less and less people representing outside.
In the years that you've been engaged in this, what about individual states that you may have been engaged with? Have you found any American government, any European government to have been particularly effective and active?
Absolutely.
Which ones?
Ireland. Although, having said that, I will follow myself very quickly by saying that on Tuesday of this week, I don't know if you are aware, but Ireland is having significant crises with finance, and particularly the homeless crisis. But because we're running around the world at the moment with our hand out looking for new trade deals, they're at the moment looking on deepening and broadening their trade partnership with Bahrain. And this week the Irish are hosting an event in Manama to relationship capacity building on trade in Bahrain, which is really something that I'm very personally dismayed about. We have some big business over there. The electrical board is done by an Irish company in Bahrain. The water is sourced from Ireland, Clare Springs. The duty free in Bahrain is an Irish company, Orienta, that does that. So we actually have a really big relationship with them, and we can't afford to criticize them too much. However, given our own history of supporting people who are struggling for self-determination, we are very active on behalf of the community within Bahrain. So it behooves us to continue to support the people who are struggling there. And then other European states that have been helpful, Switzerland obviously, and the Scandinavian countries. But over the periodic review, each of the suggestions that were made at the last session, the Bahraini regime agreed to the vast majority of them. However, they haven't been implemented. So we're trying to continue to put pressure on them to really be realistic and to work logically with making change, but the willingness is not there.
Matthew, you mentioned to me before we sat down that you're off to Washington. What's your sense of the bilateral versus international, in respect to your release, in respect to your case? Do you think that either one or the other had a role, or indeed something that Tara's just mentioned? Was it the media that embarrassed them?
So, on a pure personal experience, I would put it down solely to the media exposure and to Danny's campaign to be able to apply that pressure and stick it and maintain its presence in the public arena. I would sadly disagree in terms of those ideas of partnership and trying to build a consensus towards human rights and to build a continued awareness purely based on what I saw.
Do you mean partnership between like a Western state and the...
Correct. And it tends to be as and when they want to make a statement or when they want to follow something up, and they won't ever follow through with tangible practices. The people that I saw when I was put in a public prison for a few days included Americans who had been in jail for 18 months with no charges, purely because he was linked to 1MDB. He was the CEO of one of the public sovereign wealth funds that was under Sheikh Mansour. Now, he then got given a life sentence in prison, but this was all under Sheikh Mansour, who should be the one being tried for corruption. Now, because he was American, the Americans weren't following up on his, any form of trial, any form of publicity, because it had those diplomatic relations. When it came to my own case, the Foreign Office was very reluctant to make those significant points of discussion that were very blatant and obvious, and they still deny it.
Why were they reluctant, do you think?
It's going to be down to putting their own relationship and the array of different values and trade partnership deals and whatever else they are working on above that of an individual, of a citizen. And so when you try taking that further, that scope, and expanding it to discuss values, it may work in security cooperation, and you do see that a lot, especially counterterrorism or in those harder issues. You see an enhanced partnership. When it comes to those softer social values, that doesn't tend to be implemented or accepted anywhere near as thoroughly.
Which to my mind speaks against the bilateral.
Correct. Yeah. But that's my experience of seeing it in a certain way. So. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
No problem.
We discussed earlier in the day human rights defenders, the role of human rights defenders. There's no shortage in the Gulf. Yahya talked about Akra, Raif Badawi, Lujain. There's Bahrain, Nabil Rajab, Abdul Hadi Khwaja, Al Salman, Ahmed Mansour, to some degree Nasser Bilghaith. I think now the stateless Bidun activist in Kuwait, Abdul Hakim Al-Fadli, has done so much for the stateless community there. Human rights defenders play an incredibly important role, it seems to me. What is it going to take, in your minds, to have the kind of implicit agency that they had to get that to kind of empower them to reach human liberty 2.0 in Gulf states? What needs to, how do we elevate them to give them some agency or give more agency? What are your thoughts, Ty? I mean, how much more can we cannot go into Kuwait in the central prison and get Abdul Hakim Al-Fadli out of prison. We cannot go into the Bahraini prisons and get these human rights, or Ahmed Mansour. What more can we do to, I mean, we've touched on the role of media and these international, is there some other role for us? What's it going to take? Is it a digital empowerment? What are your thoughts about what more we can do?
I think that firstly, the media plays a really big role, as Matthew was saying, and also briefing diplomats, like going to these reviews, making sure that there is pressure on the governments and making sure that people are aware of these human rights defenders who are imprisoned. But also I think that one big role that human rights defenders play in the Gulf, where civic society is so constrained, is getting information out to us, to people who are in countries or places where we have slightly more freedoms. And I think this is one way of honoring people's sacrifices, and it's also really the role of human rights defenders, I think, at the moment in the Gulf states. It's making sure that we can also work on their cases and put pressure on governments from the outside.
I would be hesitant nearly to say that we can help them deliberately on an act-by-act basis. Fundamentally, you can't go in and interrupt the sovereignty of a state. And that's where these foreign states will often draw a line and say, well, we can't actually go that step further. They will often be a national of a state looking at human rights issues within their own country. So they have even less security, even less support than than that from someone outside. The only thing we can do is publicly acknowledge the circumstances within which they operate. And when I say we acknowledge it, that is a state. So if you have a look at the Foreign Office travel advice for the Gulf states, for example, they'll say to a large extent they're fairly safe to go to, but there's no acknowledgement of the legal difficulties of the acts of repression that do occur. And once that is acknowledged publicly, then there's a heightened sense of what they stand for and what they don't accept.
Okay, just to pick up on one point that you said there, I think it's quite an interesting one. Every government produces travel advisories about going to a particular country. Is there an argument, do you think, the three of you, do you think, to say or to try to pressurize the British government or American government to say, actually, this is a country that kills its journalists, okay, in one case, in one of its consulates? Should that be reflected in a travel advisory? Should the travel advisory to the UAE say, last year, a British national was detained without charge? Should that form part of their official advice? And what do we need to do to include that, if that's the case?
So there are countries that do produce this type of documentation. The State Department does yearly, and there are a few others.
And they include that kind of information?
Correct, yes. Okay. And then they will highlight those examples. Now, it won't be their job to go through the legal parameters, the full extent of what is available, and they'll be very conservative with their discourse, but they will still have to highlight some of those difficulties. Taking that line and publicly acknowledging it on that state-to-state level would further pressure them and make them have to double think what they're doing. Because there isn't a way that we can interrupt the sovereignty of another country. It's just not possible. The only other way is to give asylum for more people who want to leave.
I mean, Tara, just before you start, some of you may be familiar that the Dutch government has a so-called Safe Cities program where people at risk can be nominated to go and live in a city in the Netherlands for a year. Do these kind of initiatives shame or show up a government for human rights violations, and are they a way forward? Is that the kind of thing you can imagine in Ireland?
No, I think that Ireland is a very bad case to take, frankly. We have a really bad track record with directive provision and leaving people in terrible circumstances for a very long time. And now with our own homelessness crisis as well, so no, it's a very bad example. Ideologically, yeah, Ireland is a great country and everything. We're very welcoming, but in practice, it's not the case. I personally, I think that regardless of the intergovernmental relations, and speaking about bilaterally then, to empower communities and to infuse discourse amongst the society, I think has been very helpful. That's what I've seen internationally.
And society has taken these
societies. So, for example, if you go to a university and you have a conference on, I had a conference on torture earlier in the year, and there were people brought from different countries who came and spoke at it, and also Irish people who were victims of clerical abuse. For the people to be able to have solidarity with each other and commune together on their different types of torture, the key understanding that they reached together was that they had all been dehumanized. So when the Nazis did it, it was done in Rwanda. When a section of the populace has been dehumanized, then the perpetrators, they can have some resolve in their mind. They don't feel that there's going to be a consequence for them. They don't see themselves. They have othered the victims so much, and that, I think, is what has happened in Bahrain. And when you go to a university and speak, or the trade unions, or in Ireland, the National Women's Council, wherever you take the message and can bring representatives to tell the story, and you're talking to lay people, then it's creating a vibrant discourse around the issue. And I think that is much more effective than only using the media or governments or diplomatic relations.
Matthew, just before you jump in, just can you give me one or two examples of trade union activism?
So in Ireland, when Mahdi Abu Deeb was imprisoned and Jalila Al-Salman, we had the Global Solidarity Committee was held in Dublin that year, and not Reem Khalifa. Jalila Al Salman came over to Dublin with the lady who was the head of the Nurses and Midwives organisation in Bahrain, and they both spoke. The trade unions then awarded Jalila Al Salman and Mahdi Abu Deeb, who is still in prison in Etesha. And so they had a much more international profile. Rula, thank you, yeah, Rula Safar. And also bearing in mind too that many of the medics who were arrested and tortured in Bahrain had been, they had done their licensing with the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, so again another tie with Bahrain for the Irish. But raising their profiles internationally, much as Frontline Defenders does with defenders and makes them more prominent, to be able to do that with people, to put the face on the name just for the people, it creates a discourse in the society of a country. So I think that that was useful.
And that raises the question of media. Matthew.
I was just going to say it's, because this is something that I've been dealing with in terms of ethics of human interaction, especially in field work. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's unethical to try and help communities in those countries, but it's all well and good for us to say that we should try and empower those communities within Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, wherever it is, but we're doing it from outside in. We have no ability, we have no responsibility, we have no ability to support their welfare. We can go and try and encourage them, but should anything happen, they're by themselves, there's nothing that we can do. So how far does that support, what can you do to help them? It can only be done from the outside, it can only be done at a different level. That's why I say it's not unethical, but it's not far off it.
May I?
Yeah.
In 2011, 2012, at the height of this revolution, so the young men in the streets were being shot at and then arrested, and if they needed to go to hospital, they couldn't have hospital care because they were arrested from their hospital beds. And there was all of the doctors and medics who had been arrested. There weren't very many people left to treat anyone, but there was an underground hospital facility that sprang up and was very necessary. So I was in Ireland, and all I'm doing really is refuting on an impact that can be had from the outside in. So I was able to connect people who needed urgent care to somebody perhaps who was in Sweden who knew a doctor who was working inside, who might be in one of the villages, and from night to night different homes were used as clinical care centres. There were 2 cases of boys who were shot in the face with tear gas, one with a tear gas canister, and he lost his eye, and then a little boy who was only 4 years old, Ahmed Al-Naim, and he was shot at point blank range with a shotgun, and he lost one eye also. But we brought those 2 boys to Ireland to have their eye replaced in Ireland. There was also an incident where a body, I'm very reluctant to name any names of anybody at all. There was a guy who his body was washed up on the beach, and he had a slight mental retardation. His family asked for an inquest into his death, and the regime refused to give it. It was discovered through people that I know, and that it had been facilitated from outside, that a forensic and a doctor had gone in and managed to make a report on the corpse, and found that the man had actually been electrocuted repeatedly, but that his body, when he was taken out to sea in a boat and they pushed him into the water, so he drowned, but he wasn't dead when they pushed him into the water. He was unconscious from being electrocuted. So there were things that we could do from the outside that wouldn't have been possible only within. They're very few and far between, but they can have a significant impact. And the fallout from that then is the media attention around that that creates such a massive embarrassment for them.
My immediate takeaway from the things that you've been saying against that dichotomy of state versus, or bilateral versus IGO, intergovernmental organizations, actually is something that Tara's raised and the others also a little bit, is kind of a networking. It's a glorified networking. It's unions, people who know people inside, so it's bridging that way of that kind of dichotomy. I want to bridge that dichotomy in another way and talk about a little bit about academic freedom. We've already touched on how Western universities, many universities, are in the Gulf. Are these universities, the academic freedom, academic inquiry that they propose, they hold out, they promise, is that a way forward? Is there an issue about academic freedom in the Gulf?
Definitely there is, without question. One of my colleagues he oversees PhDs in some of the Gulf universities, and also with expats who are living over here and studying here.
Are you able to say the field?
No. But he found that, so there were a couple of instances where people who had produced their paper with flying colours, whatever, had gone back and presented their paper at home, and unfortunately they had punitive measures taken against them for the content of their thesis.
Are you able to name the country?
Saudi Arabia. And it also happened in Bahrain as well. So I do. They don't have their educational freedom inside the country, but the individuals themselves don't have it when they come out to be educated outside the country.
So just to be clear, we're talking about somebody from the Gulf who studied in the West, broadly speaking, who then went back and had troubles on return.
Absolutely.
Okay.
You're completely correct about the critical thinking. That's something which it's not just, it's disencouraged. There's nearly an anti-technocratic type of mentality towards, especially public sector work. The more closed-minded you are, the less questions you ask, the higher up you'll go. Now, if you then look at how that knowledge is created and generated within those countries in the Gulf, what are the predominant degrees being undertaken by the students? They're going to be engineering, there'll be business. You'll find very, very, very few will be undertaking social science degrees or humanities, for the sole reason that they don't want to encourage that form, that scope of thinking. Second of all, look at the legislation that's surrounding the restriction of academic ability, full stop, and you'll find these international partnerships with foreign universities. They'll be there advertising the fact that there is that same educational experience that you would have in the West with that in the UAE or in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia, to varying degrees. That's just untrue. It's the same in Qatar as it is in Saudi Arabia.
Do you mean that if they're advertising the English literature course being offered by Georgetown in Doha, that it's censored? That's basically what you're saying.
To varying degrees. There'll be certain topics stayed away from. So if there were topics of, say, homosexuality within literature, would that then be touched? Would that discourse, would that book be engaged with the same way? That's on a very, that's at one extreme. What about political issues? How much further that topic would be discussed, or what's allowed? What literature are you allowed to engage with? What sources can you access online? What freedom of speech can you have on the campus? It's that whole ability of critical thinking is just not, that environment is not there.
Sorry, just before, do you know of any examples of where, for example, a university magazine from any one of these universities, a campus magazine itself has imposed either self-censorship or been censored?
In the Gulf, no, but at New York University in America, on their board are board members of the Abu Dhabi Executive Council. Now, NYU has a campus in Abu Dhabi, and members who are highly linked to the Abu Dhabi royal family, in with the sovereign wealth funds, are able to use their formal links with an American university to repress a strong word, but to apply pressure to veer their reporting of issues in New York away from that could be critical towards the UAE. That's the most prominent example I can think of. I haven't ever engaged with students in the Gulf countries because there are connotations. It comes back to that ethical dilemma. Can you engage with those students? Can you discuss those topics with them without endangering them? Because for you, if you get deported, you get deported. But for that student who's there, there's nothing you can do or say that could help them from that situation. There's nothing you can do.
So going back to what Matthew said, I think it's also interesting to see the kind of topics that Gulf states sponsor when students are studying abroad. So where I work, for example, there's a Kuwait program, and what I've noticed is that all the students who come from Kuwait are working on public health or health topics, so topics that aren't seen to be political. And also within this, I think that this kind of self-censorship or censorship links to the stifling of free expression in the Gulf, across the Gulf. So we're seeing now that there's loads of cybercrime laws that are popping up, and in these cybercrime laws, any speech that criticizes the government, that criticizes the authorities, or is seen as threatening is criminalized, and people can go to prison for up to 15 years for saying something that the authorities don't like. And this is what we're seeing with loads of the human rights defenders who are in prison at the moment in Saudi, for example. And also just to emphasize that this also applies, for example, in Qatar, where criticism of the emir is criminalized, I think, in the constitution. We see it in Kuwait, we see it in the UAE. Yeah. I don't work on Bahrain, so I don't know. I've never worked on Bahrain.
However, Nabil Rajab was over in Dublin with me in 2014, and bless you, and I brought him to RTE, which is Radio Telefi Sharon, it's our national broadcaster, and I was on the primetime show with him in the evening. We were both interviewed with a fantastic journalist who has gone to be one of the chief editors in the New York Times, Malachi Brown, and Nabil spoke about what was happening in Bahrain at the time, and when he went back to Bahrain and they arrested him for the tweet that he had put out on Yemen, and that Bahrainis had, the regime, it was a ground to foment Daesh, and he was arrested and subsequently tortured and is still in prison. But they used the footage that he had been filmed on while he was speaking in Dublin on our national broadcaster. And I personally, I feel guilty because something that I had, in all good faith, thought that would be useful and helpful to the people inside the country, and that he did too, never for a moment thinking that there would be a consequence as negative as that. And I'm left with that feeling. So exactly what you had said, we can try and help from the outside, but sometimes the things that we do are more damaging than they are positive. And no matter how hard we try with Nabil and Abdul Hadi Al-Khawaja, and the numerous, countless others, and many nameless others, they're still in prison. We haven't been successful in getting them out. In fact, one of the medics who was released after a long, long time recently contacted me and said, Tara, thanks for everything that you did to try and lobby for our release. And I said, but we failed. We failed. No matter how hard we worked on it, we failed. And you can feel, you can become incredibly despondent when you realize that it seems that you're having absolutely no success. You can give your lifeblood for this. We are fighting against very tyrannical regimes, and it becomes personally insidious, the attacks that we have as a result of it. But the level of responsibility, another lady in Ireland who had gone to visit Bahrain, and she had led a women's protest over there, was staying in the villages with some of the people that she knew personally. She had lived there years ago, and she was actually deported because of her involvement in these protests. One of the families that she stayed with, there was a young guy who, when she first met him, he was 14, and one particular afternoon he was being chased through the streets by soldiers and police, and he knew that if they caught him that he'd be beaten within an inch of his life. He was aiming for his grandmother's house, but he stopped about 4 doors away from her house because he realized all the women, his mother and all his aunties, were there with his grandmother, and rather than leaving them at the mercy of the mercenaries who were after him, he just stopped and allowed himself to be taken. So this lady, who's a friend of mine, the Irish woman, he eventually was released from prison. They tried to turn him, so they will take young guys and they'll break their teeth, and they'll beat them up, and they will try to force them to inform on their friends and drive them around streets at night and push them into giving names if they can manage. And this young guy was so afraid that they were going to do this to him and that he might say anything. And he allowed himself to, he just really sacrificed himself. And my friend was saying to him, you know, let's report it, let's talk about it and raise your profile. Subsequently, he was arrested again, and then last year he was executed. And when he was shot dead by the regime with the other two guys who were shot at the same time, her heart absolutely broke, and she hasn't been able to re-engage with human rights since then. So when you become personally involved, and if you're not part of an organization like Amnesty or Frontline Defenders, and you don't have that strength of a team behind you, and you're an individual doing your very best with your single standard and your single sword, you just don't have the resources and the collective skills that can help to empower and focus your work. So there are varying degrees of success and not, but the culpability always lies solely with the tyrants who are doing this. And eventually, inshallah, Nabeel will be free, and Abdulhadi al-Khawaja. We're all continuing. The fight is not going away. We have plenty of it left in us. But our challenges are very many in that.
Thanks. I want to finish really, really briefly on the opportunity of bright spots. Any hope, the kind of glass half full, half empty debate. And in this, I want to come back to something that we've already discussed in this room. You know, there is an argument, it seems to me, to say that the pressure created by women driving themselves illegally then created the upward pressure in order to create the campaign, in order that led to this rather, as Yahya was saying, or rather meaningless, but nonetheless an act in order to allow women the right to drive. There are arguably other bright spots. What are the ones that you can think of, if any?
So I was trying to think of something. And I want to talk about, first of all, on the international level. At the moment, there's a treaty that's being developed on business and human rights. So it's a legally binding instrument. That means that all these organizations or companies that are, say, based in Israel, who are currently spying on dissidents or people who've spoken out against the government, it means that maybe in 10 years, 15 years' time, they won't be able to do this internationally. And they're also developing an optional protocol, which basically means that you can bring cases to the UN against these companies and against either the country that they're domiciled in, so where their headquarters are, if they go against the standards that are being developed. And I think this is a really bright spot for the Gulf, where we're seeing loads of dissidents being spied on and being sort of imprisoned for tweets and other activities on social media.
Other examples of good or progress being made is possibly the international acknowledgement to varying degrees of the behavior. Where there could have been a whitewashing of the behavior towards that in the Gulf, there is a more public acknowledgement that these states act in the way they do. There's a bit more public criticism. It's not mainstream in the same way, and that idea of narrative is something which these states often try and rely on to support themselves. This is gradually being eroded. I would, however, say that these states are becoming more and more desperate. And that's, you see that in the tactics, you see that in the strategy, you see that in the way they are increasing the ways and means which they repress society, the legal framework in which they do it. That's a serious negative spiral in this way, and the extremes to which they're willing to go, and the fact that, sadly, because we acknowledge the fact that they act in a certain way, there's no punishment for it. There's no attribution. to that extent. And sadly, that's the dilemma that we stay in. But we shouldn't ever try to normalize that behavior. Acknowledge it publicly and let them, if they're going to act in that way, try and restrict the ability for them to do it going forward.
Tara, just a final point. I'm told that we can actually have Lynn's clip before we go to questions. So this will be, we're going to end with Tara's comment now, and then I think Mohammed will go to Lynn Malouf's clip, and then we'll go to questions. Or
Just
clarifications, comments.
Really quickly then, speaking on an individual case basis, on a bright spot. For example, there's a young man here in London. His name is Ali Mashema, and his father, Hassan Mashema, is one of the leaders of the opposition who's been in prison for the last number of years. And Hassan Mashema has had cancer. He wasn't receiving medical care at all, or results from any tests that he had had years ago, and Ali has a number of times gone on hunger strike, and a number of times taken even to the roof of the embassy, the Bahraini embassy, along with his colleague, friend, compatriot, Musa. And so eventually Hassan Mashema has received some medical care. So there can be some room for maneuver if there is the possibility of doing something very significant like that. But usually it has to be really desperate when it gets to a point that it's absolutely desperate. So there are instances where there's some progress of some sort, and really any wiggle room at all is progress.
I mean, to my mind, that actually raises the whole thing about embarrassing the government into doing that, which is something that Bill and Haifa and others will talk about in the media session. Thank you for that. Mohammed, are you ready with the clip? Hopefully with sound.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I was asked to say a few words about what the Gulf would look like in an ideal world. Now, coming from Lebanon, this past month, we have seen hundreds of thousands of people going to the streets every single day across the country, but also in Iraq, and now recently in Kuwait, where people have been demanding their basic human rights, because what they do want, what they are in the streets to demand, is for a vision for a better future for themselves and the next generations. The vision of an inclusive civil society, an inclusive society where the rights of every single citizen is secured. Now, a Gulf without repression, a Gulf in an ideal world would look like one where the government would not be arbitrarily detaining citizens and subjecting them to unfair political trials with no due process, as happened to over a dozen stateless Kuwaitis just this summer. The government would not be persecuting people for dissident political speech, as happened to former MP Oussama Tamimi this year, after he tried to bridge sectarian divides in the Bahraini parliament. The government would not be holding people in miserable conditions of detention simply as political punishment, as the UAE has done to esteemed human rights defender Ahmed Mansour this year, who has been held almost incommunicado in solitary confinement in a cell with no bed, no recreation, and no running water. The authorities in an ideal world would be championing human rights defenders and peaceful activists as proud citizens in their countries who dedicate their lives towards pushing for an inclusive and thriving civil society, one in which all citizens have their basic rights protected and fulfilled. The efforts and decades-long campaigning by brave women human rights activists would be recognized when there are positive reforms, such as those we recently saw in Saudi Arabia, for example, in relation to the guardianship system. These women would not be punished by being detained, imprisoned, ill-treated, tortured for having championed and called for these reforms. In an ideal world, in an ideal Gulf, the citizens would feel protected and safe when they choose to go to the streets to express their views in a peaceful manner, even when this involves criticism of their authorities' policies. People should not be arrested, detained, faced with vague charges leading to imprisonment, simply for having had the courage to express their views publicly. Let us hope for a better Gulf, one in which all citizens feel safe, secure, in demanding their rights, and in their struggle to secure their basic human rights. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lynn. In absence, thanks, Mohammed. We've got a bit of time for questions, comments, clarifications. Let's start back there. Do you have a spare? Can you give that mic? Oh, you're going to help. Great. Thank you so much. There's a gentleman at the back, and then your dad.
I think Matthew mentioned how negative media coverage embarrasses the Gulf regimes. I don't know how pertinent this is. There was a famous case of Sheikh Al-Latifa, a member of the Royal House of Dubai, which was kidnapped as she was trying to escape to India, then taken back. And she appeared later drugged on television. The only Gulf country in which I lived, or which I've direct experience, is actually Qatar, Doha. And there was a case, not much spoken about, of under Sheikh Hamad, his sister also tried to escape to Egypt. She was actually kidnapped and taken back by the Sheikh's secret police. So my question is, why are we not making enough of these examples to, I know these are princesses, but they're women, so it's part of rights of women. Are we trying, but could we not make more of these negative examples?
I can't remember your name, actually.
Thank you. The issue is now the GCC money significant. Not just now in the academia. Academia is one area in the having share. If you now visit Washington, you find that there are a lot of GCC money think tanks. Different think tanks are relying on projects financed by other countries. Especially now providing the fight between the UAE and Qatar. In order to the PR people, the beauty of the aviation, military, there's so much. In fact, more of that is already, this is a huge thing. Academia is only one area. There are very able use this political area that they have now. So it's a very, the scope of the town is very difficult, and especially in places like Washington. Very sad.
And do you have a counter suggestion as to what we should be doing?
Well, there should be, the trouble is, many companies really rely on money in order to sustain themselves. So they find, they give them targets, for certain things, But then, the trouble is, there are always indirect, condition attached to the funding. That's very sad. So it's very sad. There's exploitation of the need in the West.
Simon?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all of you for your really interesting remarks. I have a question and a comment, if I may.
Please.
My question concerns this discussion about bilateral relations. I think that's really important. But what about go-to organizations? What about the likes of the EU, UN, international organizations? Remember, Tara, we were in Brussels and there was a lot of discussion about the role of the EU. And it seemed that was maybe an avenue through which there might be scope to facilitate dare I say change? Something, so I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Simon, do you mean like via funding of projects or diplomatic pressure?
Diplomatic pressure, diplomatic relations, dialogue, things like that, not so much funding. And my comment is just to support this theme for academic freedoms. I've got a number of PhD students in the Gulf, and there's a bit of an issue in terms of universities obviously being under a great deal of pressure, financial pressure, pressure to take students, etc., etc. We've taken an approach in the Gulf. We're happy to let them go and investigate whatever it is that they want to do, whatever they want to pursue a PhD on, as long as it's got good academic rigor, etc. We're more than happy to do that, even though we know that there are potential consequences when they go back home. I've discussed this with a number of people recently. They have to then go and register their PhD work, get it verified by the state.
And that's in every Gulf country that process happens.
I don't know about every single Gulf country, but I know that it certainly takes place in some of them. I've heard anecdotally about others. But it strikes me that
Do you think there's anything they can do to protect them?
Yeah, I think there is. Whether they have the information to.
Matthew's nodding.
Yeah, so what they were doing, I think Mark as well, and James could attest to this. If there's a golf scholar writing a PhD, they can write one to be able to pass the Viva, and then write a second one that they can take back home with them. And the one that's used to pass the Viva is not thrown, but it's not able to be publicly viewed and shared. The one that they take back home with them is a toned down version. And that's something that does regularly happen with golf students.
Can you just explain for me how that works in terms of registration or academic standardization? How is that, who recognizes, what is the actual work? Is the work the one that's lodged and filed with the university, or is it the one that they go back and says everything is fine and the sun shines?
Depends who for. It's different for different audiences because they wouldn't be able to use the same piece. If it's, as long as to the regime, as long as it's passed as Viva, they don't know which one it is that's actually passed. And that's kind of deliberately the point.
Because they're not in the room during the Viva.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, you two guys are first.
I guess my question is about Matthew. To what extent do you think social science, given the fact that there are all these hindrances to golf-based academies, inviting academies to learn to golf, to what extent can social sciences drive people to be more inclusive or gravitate towards study focused on, for example, use of sports? Is there anything that hasn't been done with intervention in the organization to suggest to be able to drive students towards these approaches?
I know, Matthew, before you answer, have you got any ideas?
No, I don't.
Okay. Sahar, yeah, can you just pass that to Sahar? She couldn't contain herself. Just
Sorry,
indulge.
I had to talk. It's just a suggestion that yes, the universities can do more than two versions of their PhD, one for the government come back and one here. And one of the simplest thing is actually the lecturers to organize themselves and not accept students from the goal unless they have the absolute freedom to research and write whatever they want. And the financial pressure.
They need the money.
They do need money, but then the lecturers, if they actually strive or if they put a list of demands or asks that it is part of the academic freedom to enable students to enjoy their academic experience with full autonomy, then they could actually put pressure through finances. I mean, it's just a suggestion. I mean, how many lecturers out there, how many PhD supervisors who will organize themselves to put some pressure on their sponsors?
Sounds a little bit idealistic to me.
I don't know. I think that it could be targeted through the trade unions, possibly the
Okay.
Congress of Trade Unions. We'll have a chat about that.
Okay, we've got a couple more minutes.
Just in relation to this.
Yeah, by all means. And then
What I wanted to say is I kind of agree with Sahar. I understand that this is like I'm not going back to the golf, no one's going to imprison me, and this is like a practical solution, but also like, why don't we want more? Like, why are we settling for less academic rigor? Why are we toning ourselves down in order to like, I don't know, abide by the standards of some dictator? Like, we want more, we should strive for more, not 2 PhDs, like the PhD that we have, you know?
fair enough. Oh, sorry, I missed you last time. But just let's.
There you go. I'm talking here about the position, Bahraini position in terms of that focusing on where is the problem, why the Bahraini regime is not changing. And in the recent 3 years, the focus has been more targeting the supporters of the regime, rather than focusing on the regime itself. If we don't change, the supporters of the regime. I think we live here in
And who are those supporters?
For example, just to give an example here, we live in the UK here, we can influence the foreigners. I mean, each time, I mean, I don't know how
Easier
much
said than done.
No, I know it's not an easy task. policies about protecting sexual dreams. I mean, we know there were examples of in the past when there were like problems in terms of. One example, we had an example when Bahrain was opposition targeted and focused on with the opposition in Victoria, who was exporting tear gas. And then the opposition used that in Victoria to put pressure on the government.
On the Korean government?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we can do the same here. In fact, we have more opportunities here. There is a lot of influence from the foreign sphere on what happened in Bahrain. Maybe you can't see it here as I can understand that. But they visit here more than they visit Washington. The king of Bahrain, they have lots of influence. And we have seen it in 2011 when they released some of the prisoners in Bahrain. It was through the pressure here. So there is a lot of things that can be done. It's not just, working on changing, we focus on the details while neglecting the main supporters of the regime.
First you and then the one at the back, but I'm just going to abuse my position a little bit just to let you know that Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, throughout 2018, asked the Foreign Office for a meeting with the Bahrain team, and we got no reply. After you, I don't know your name. Well, then how do we engage with them?
The media.
Yeah?
Can I give you one go?
Very quickly, and then the media will be addressed by Bill and Haifa in the next session.
When there were crises about immigrants who came from, I don't know which country here, and they were not given residency, nationality, etc., etc. When this was uncovered to the media against the Ministry of Justice and the Immigration Department, then it was resolved. The same thing can happen with the Foreign Office.
Inshallah.
My question is for Taif. Actually, you mentioned the UPR at the beginning. I just wanted to ask, is there any additional steps that can be done to make the UPR more binding or more conditioning? I think it's one of the biggest things that has been happening over the last not just in the Middle East in general. I will give an example with Egypt or like government officials will not actually care about the UPR because it's not by any means binding. We looked at a couple of days ago, by the way, for Egypt, and the Egyptian permanent president was like, we don't care for the UPR, the president of the parliament. So is there any steps in your mind that would be taken to make this more effective or more binding?
And solve it in 30 seconds.
Okay. First of all, the issue with the UPR is that it's a peer review, so it's UN member states reviewing UN member states. If you're an ally, you'll say like, oh, your human rights record is great, and some other person who hates this country will come up and be like, they have the worst human rights record in the universe. So this is the biggest problem, I think. It's contradictory, it's not legally binding, but what we can do with the recommendations is we can, one, do mid-term reporting as civil society. So usually the process is, it takes place every 4.5 years, so you could do a report in 2 years to see how the state is getting on with the recommendations it's accepted, with the recommendations it hasn't accepted. And I think really there's just a really big part for civil society to play in pushing states to uphold recommendations that have been made. Beyond that, I'm not sure. I think it's probably like the most political and somewhat iffy mechanisms there are at the UN.
Okay, it comes out to me. Could you pass the microphone, please, back to those two? You two are the last two, and then I've already eaten into Rodri's time a little bit, so we're going to start the next session a little bit late. Actually, would you mind passing it to, she did have her hand up before you. Sorry about that.
First, I'm glad that you're having this conversation about the goal and human rights program of many, and points that say a lot why human rights and the body are not on the agenda and not discussed very much in the West. And from human rights in the gun, as much about the gun as about us, Western democracy. Because this partnership does not exist without the complicity of the West and all the big business of comparative growth rate, but if they are wealthy countries and our democracy here is tended to put businesses before human rights, and how can we change this trend?
Can I consider that a comment rather than? And yeah, because we're eating together. And you, sir, the final contribution to the for this session.
What I say, how the protest goes on in non-Arab countries, while those people who want to study from down, they should be wise for the oppressed people in the state. State power is a big power. We have seen in some Muslim countries and non-Arab countries. It does make a difference. Somebody has to go attack. People from Gulf, the new generation, they know how to change it. They should take a lead from country street power. That will be reported in Western media. Nobody talks about that. I don't know why they're afraid. We do in Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Morocco and everywhere. It did make a difference. What we think is not be done in academic level. It's got to be street level. Thank you.
That raises a lot of questions. I mean, yes, they can. It tends not to end very well. But with that, I want to stop eating into, we now should be starting the next session. So please get a coffee quickly, drink it quickly, come back. Rodri, you've got 10 minutes. Thank you, you three, for taking part. Thank you all for indulging us.
It's been wonderful. Lots of really interesting questions. I'm actually working on the course and